mechanic fixed a stranger's flat tire for free, only to discover she owned the car dealership chain and his heart. The sun was setting behind the low hills of Mason Creek, casting a golden glow across the sleepy town. Jake wiped the grease from his hands with a rag as he turned off the lights inside his garage, the closed sign already hanging crooked in the window. The day had been long, filled with busted radiators, leaky hoses, and an old truck that had fought him every step of the way. He was locking the front door when he heard it, a sharp hiss, followed by the unmistakable rumble of a car dragging itself across gravel on a ruined tire. The sleek black vehicle turned the corner and slowed in front of his shop. Smoke rose in lazy curls from under the hood, and the front passenger side tire had gone flat, shredded at the edge. The car rolled to a stop just feet from his sign, and the engine cut with a sputter. For a second, Jake considered pretending not to notice. It was late, he was tired. But then the door opened. A woman stepped out. She looked to be in her late 20s, wearing jeans, boots, and a light jacket. Her hair was tied back loosely, a few strands sticking to her face from the heat of the engine. She was clearly flustered, but her posture remained upright, composed. "Excuse me," she said, walking toward him. Her voice was firm, but there was a tightness behind it. "Can you help me? My tire blew out just a few miles back, and then the engine started smoking. I tried flagging down someone on the road, but no one stopped." Jake raised an eyebrow, scanning the car, then the woman. "You're a bit late. I was just about to lock up." She sighed and glanced at her car. "Please, I'm on my way home. I didn't expect to end up stranded." Jake exhaled through his nose. "I don't usually take walk-ins after hours, especially not ones that roll in smoking." Her shoulders tensed, but she didn't beg. "I understand. I'll figure something out." She started back toward her car, but Jake ran a hand through his messy hair and called after her. "Hold on! You're not walking back in those boots. Let me take a look." She turned, surprised. "You'll help?" Jake shrugged. "You look like you really need it." A moment later, he had the hood up and the tools out. She stood nearby, watching as he moved with calm efficiency, checking the radiator, testing connections, then circling to the flat tire. "You're lucky you didn't shred the rim," he said. "This thing's not built for bad roads." "I've figured that out a bit too late," she muttered, half smiling. He glanced at her. "You from around here?" "No," she said, "just passing through. Makes sense, town folks usually don't drive cars that fancy." She tilted her head, amused. "What, you can tell where someone's from by their car?" Jake smirked. "Sometimes." They didn't speak much after that. He worked quickly, replacing the tire with her spare, tightening bolts, cleaning out the engine's air intake and topping off the coolant. As he finished up, he dusted off his hands and walked over to her. "You should be good to go. Just don't push her too hard until you get a real checkup." She blinked. "You're not going to charge me?" Jake shook his head. "Nah." "Why?" He looked at her then, really looked. There was something in his eyes, not pity, not interest, just calm certainty. "Because sometimes people just need help. No strings, no bills. Kindness does not cost anything, but it comes back around." She stared at him for a long second, as if trying to read the words behind his simple tone. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small business card. She handed it to him. "Thank you, Jake." He looked at her, surprised. "How do?" "It's on your shirt," she said, smiling gently, pointing to his name patch. He chuckled. "Right." She handed him the card. It simply said Natalie, with a phone number and an email. No company name, no title. "If you're ever in the city, let me return the favor." Before he could reply, she was already in the car, the engine purring now with restored life. She rolled down the window before pulling away. "You didn't just fix my car, Jake. You fixed my day. Thank you." And with that, she drove off into the fading light. Jake stood in front of the garage, watching the car disappear down the quiet road. He glanced down at the card in his hand. Just a name, just Natalie. But something about her, something he couldn't quite name, lingered long after the taillights faded. A week had passed since the evening Jake had fixed her car, and the garage had settled back into its usual rhythm. Early mornings, the scent of motor oil in the air, and the steady drone of engines that came and went like clockwork. There was a peace to it, a reliable kind of repetition that Jake had grown to appreciate. Still, something about that night lingered. Maybe it was the suddenness of her arrival, or the way her voice had cracked just a little when she said, "Please." Maybe it was how she'd thanked him, not just with words, but with her eyes, with a kind of gratitude that didn't feel performative. He hadn't thought much about Natalie, at least not consciously. Her card still sat on the corner of his desk in the back office, tucked behind a faded photo of his father leaning against the old Chevy he used to work on. Jake didn't admit it to himself, but every time he glanced at that photo, the sliver of white cardstock caught his eye, as if waiting. Then, on a quiet Wednesday morning, the familiar purr of a well-tuned luxury engine rolled up to the curb. Jake was under the hood of a rusting pickup, tightening bolts on its brake system, when the sound stopped him mid-turn. He looked up. There it was. The same sleek black car, looking slightly out of place against the cracked pavement and rusted signage. The driver's door opened, and Natalie stepped out. She wore jeans again, this time paired with a navy wool sweater that fit her like it had been made for soft autumn mornings. Her hair was tied in a loose ponytail, strands dancing in the breeze. In her hands she carried a cardboard tray of 2 steaming coffees and a brown paper bag. Jake straightened, wiping his hands on a rag as she approached. There was a smile tugging at the edge of his mouth. "Back for another rescue?" he asked. She smiled, her eyes warm. "No emergency this time. Just figured you could use a decent coffee and something that's not from a vending machine." Jake raised an eyebrow, a little amused. "Well, I'll admit, you're already my favorite customer." Natalie laughed. "That's a low bar, huh?" He chuckled and motioned toward the old wooden bench outside the garage, worn smooth by time and sun. She followed him, and they sat side by side, their coffees warming their hands as light traffic drifted past. "Seriously," she said after a quiet pause, "thank you again. I was pretty shaken up that night." Jake gave a casual shrug. "You looked calm enough." "I fake it well," she replied with a wry smile. "Doesn't mean I wasn't scared out of my mind." He nodded slowly, looking out toward the road. "Most people are when they're stranded. It's not just about the car. It's about feeling like the world's moving on without you, like no one's going to stop." She turned to him. "Exactly." He glanced at her sideways, half grinning. "Lucky for you, I was locking up late." "Well," she said, her tone softening, "guess I got lucky." There was a beat of silence that felt strangely comfortable. "What is it you actually do, Natalie?" Jake asked, more curious than suspicious. "You don't strike me as someone who breaks down often." She hesitated, then answered. "Let's just say I work with cars, but not the way you do." He waited for more, but she didn't continue. He nodded. "Fair enough. We all got parts of ourselves we'd rather not hand over right away." Her eyes flickered toward him. "And what's one of yours?" Jake looked down at his coffee. "I've been trying to save up. My dream's to open a training garage. A place where kids, ones who don't get second chances, can learn something real. Not everyone's cut out for college, but anyone can learn how to fix something with their hands." Natalie's eyes softened. "That's incredible." Jake gave a modest shrug. "It's not much yet, just an idea, and an old building out past the river." "It's more than most people do with an idea," she said. He looked at her for a moment, surprised by the gentleness in her voice. "Thanks." From that day forward, Natalie became a quiet part of the garage's life. Sometimes she brought lunch, sometimes just conversation. She'd sit on the bench while Jake worked, asking questions about pistons and gearboxes, and laughing at the names he gave to cars with personalities. She had a knack for listening, not just nodding, but really listening, and he found himself telling her things he hadn't said in years. She never mentioned her full name, never brought up her company or title. She liked the way Jake looked at her, not with expectation but with ease. She didn't feel like she was being measured, she just felt like herself. Jake noticed the way she asked about his mother's health, the way she stayed longer each time. There was something grounding about her presence, something that made the shop feel less like a job and more like a place he wanted to be. And so, amid grease-streaked hands, half-eaten sandwiches, and the hum of engines, something unspoken took root. A warmth, a quiet rhythm, a connection. Neither rushed it, neither named it, but it grew anyway. It was late afternoon when Jake parked his truck in front of the old building on the outskirts of town. The place stood silent under the orange haze of the setting sun, looking like a relic from another lifetime. Rust streaked down its tin roof, paint peeled from the weather-worn signage that once proudly bore the name Warren's Auto Repair, and weeds curled through cracks in the gravel lot. The windows, now boarded or broken, reflected nothing but fading light. Jake sat still for a moment, his hand resting on the steering wheel, then glanced over at Natalie in the passenger seat. Her expression was unreadable, curious but respectful. He gave her a nod, then stepped out. "This," he said, gesturing toward the building, "used to be my dad's garage." Natalie followed him, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. The wind lifted strands of her hair, brushing them across her cheek. She looked up at the structure, at the decaying wood and faded lettering, and something inside her twisted, not because it was ugly, but because Jake looked at it like it was sacred. "It looks like it had history," she said gently. Jake nodded. He built it from nothing, ran it for 25 years. He was one of those guys who didn't just fix cars, he made them run better than factory new. He taught me everything I know. They walked slowly toward the entrance, the creak of the old screen door breaking the quiet as Jake pushed it open. Dust danced in beams of golden light streaming through cracked windows. The inside was a ghost of what it had been. Walls once covered with tools were bare, but the outlines of where things had hung were still visible. Oil stains painted memories on the concrete floor. "I used to sit over there," Jake said, pointing to a corner where an old wooden stool still stood. "Pretended I was his apprentice when I was 5. By 15, I actually was." Natalie turned in place, her gaze taking in every inch of the room. She imagined a younger Jake here, grease on his fingers, a wide-eyed boy watching his father with reverence. The thought made her chest ache. "What happened to it?" she asked softly. Jake's jaw tightened. "A corporation came in 5 years ago, bought up this land and a bunch of other properties, said they'd develop something better, promised him a consultant role, even put it in writing. 2 weeks later, they bulldozed the place. No notice, no follow-up, just gone." Natalie didn't speak. Her heart was starting to pound. "He fought them," Jake continued, voice hollow. "Tried to sue, but their lawyers buried us in paperwork. All legal, all airtight. He lost everything. He went downhill fast after that, physically, emotionally. The doctors said it was his heart, but I think it just broke." He stopped. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was heavy. Natalie stared at the floor, shame burning behind her eyes. Jake looked at her, his tone softening. "Sorry, I didn't mean to unload all that on you. I just thought you should see where it all began." She nodded slowly, swallowing hard. "Thank you for showing me." He didn't ask why she'd gone quiet, and she didn't offer it. They walked back to the truck in silence, the sky now streaked with violet and gold. That night, back in her penthouse, Natalie stood by the window, staring out over a city glittering with artificial stars, glass towers and blinking billboards, her kingdom of noise and steel. But all she could see was the boarded-up garage, and Jake's eyes when he talked about his father. A corporation came in, they crushed him. She knew exactly which one. Carson Auto Group, the company that bore her name, her legacy. She had been recently promoted around that time, still eager to prove herself. She remembered the merger vaguely, another checklist in a pile of acquisitions. She had signed off on the deal, just one more property on a spreadsheet. She had never looked deeper. Now she had. Natalie turned from the window, heart racing. If he knew, if Jake ever found out the truth, that she was part of the machine that destroyed his father's dream, would he ever look at her the same? Her phone buzzed, a reminder for the board meeting she was supposed to attend in an hour. She declined the call. Later that night, her most trusted advisor, Daniel, walked into her office. He didn't knock. "You've been off lately," he said. "What's going on?" Natalie sat at her desk, hands clasped tightly. "I met someone." Daniel's brow rose. "That's surprising and rare. He doesn't know who I am. Should he?" She looked at him, eyes tired. "He thinks I'm just me, and when I'm with him, I feel like that's all I need to be." Daniel watched her closely. "And when he finds out the truth?" She exhaled. "I don't know." "You're not just anyone, Natalie. You're the CEO of one of the largest auto corporations in the country. That doesn't just a mechanic, Daniel," she said quietly. "He's the first person who's ever made me feel human, real." Daniel paused. "Then you've got a choice. Walk away now, or tell him the truth and hope the connection survives." Natalie didn't answer. Instead, she reached for her phone and made a call to the local clinic in Jake's town. The woman on the other end confirmed Jake's mother was still undergoing regular treatments. Natalie arranged for an anonymous donation to pay off the full cost of care. She added funds for a new dialysis machine and comfortable furniture for the waiting room. When asked for a name to list on the paperwork, she simply said, "No name, just someone who cares." It wasn't about erasing guilt. It was about trying to do something right, not as a CEO, not as Natalie Hudson, just Natalie. It was a slow Sunday morning, and Jake sat at the diner just down the street from his garage, sipping black coffee and flipping through a well-worn newspaper a customer had left behind. The bell over the door jingled as locals came and went, but Jake barely noticed. He was halfway through his eggs when something on the business page caught his eye. A headline in bold, "Next Gen Auto Empire, Natalie Hudson takes the wheel at Carson Auto Group." Below it, a photo, crisp and bright, of Natalie, dressed in a sleek navy suit, standing beside the CEO of Carson Auto, shaking hands at a corporate gala. Jake's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. His eyes scanned the article again and again, disbelief turning into a slow, burning realization. Natalie Hudson, CEO, Carson Auto, the very same company that had forced his father out, had bulldozed his family's legacy into rubble. And she had stood in his garage, smiled at him, brought him coffee, listened to his dreams. She knew, and she said nothing. He pushed back from the table, barely hearing the clatter of his plate as he stood, the sound of his heartbeat pounding louder than the chatter around him. By the time Natalie arrived later that afternoon, dressed in a soft green sweater, hair loose in the breeze, she found Jake waiting outside the garage, arms crossed, jaw tight. "Jake?" she asked, stepping forward. He didn't move. "So, Natalie Hudson," she stopped in her tracks. "You saw it." He nodded, eyes cold. "CEO of Carson Auto, the company that destroyed my father's life. Jake, Don't," he cut in. "Don't tell me you forgot. Or didn't know. You've known this whole time, haven't you?" Natalie swallowed hard. "I found out after we met. I didn't mean to lie. I didn't know how to tell you." He stepped closer, his voice rising. "You had so many chances, and every single time you stood there, looking me in the eye, letting me talk about my dad, about what your company did, and you said nothing. I was afraid," she said, her voice breaking. "Afraid you'd hate me, that you'd never believe how much I care." He laughed bitterly. "Care? Is that what this was? What, some guilt trip? A project? You come down here to feel better about yourself?" Natalie's eyes welled. "No, I came because you made me feel human again. Because for once, I wasn't a name or a title. I was just a person with you." Jake turned away, trying to steady his breath, but the hurt in his chest only grew heavier. "Well, congratulations. You're back to being exactly who you are, the woman who wears a different face depending on who she's talking to." "Jake, please," she whispered, stepping toward him. "Don't end it like this." He turned back, voice cold. "It already ended, the moment you decided I wasn't worth the truth." She didn't argue. Her shoulders fell as the wind picked up, clouds rolling low above them. He opened the door to his garage without another word. Natalie stood in silence for a moment longer, then slowly turned and walked away. Raindrops began to fall, soft at first, then steadily heavier, soaking through her sweater as she reached her car. She didn't bother to run, didn't bother to shield herself. The rain felt honest, and maybe that was more than she deserved. Inside the garage, Jake stood alone, staring at the card she had given him that very first night. Just a name, just Natalie. But now, he didn't know who she was anymore, or if he had ever really known her at all. The weeks that followed were a storm Jake couldn't outrun. Headlines splashed across local news sites, whispering half-truths and drawing connections where none should have existed. CEO caught in small-town scandal. Mechanic tied to corporate controversy. Is Natalie Hudson's judgment slipping? The articles never outright lied, but they twisted reality just enough to leave bruises. Jake buried himself in work, wrenching through the days and leaving the nights hollow. He fixed brakes and replaced spark plugs like a machine, shutting out the sympathetic glances from regulars, ignoring the hesitant questions from townsfolk who knew just enough to be curious and not enough to understand. Natalie hadn't come back, not to the garage, not to him, or so he kept telling himself. But peace, even the fragile kind Jake had tried to build, doesn't last when someone has a target on your back. It was a Monday when he pulled into the lot and saw it, yellow hazard tape strung across the garage doors like a slap in the face. A thick notice stapled to the entrance read, "Temporary suspension, pending safety investigation." Below it, in fine print, were vague references to potential code violations and dangerous conditions. Jake's heart dropped. Inside, chaos awaited. His carefully organized workbenches had been turned upside down. Shelves were emptied, tools tossed around like props in a stage play. There were oil stains in places they shouldn't have been, wires dangling dangerously over power outlets. It was all wrong, and Jake knew it. Someone had staged the entire thing. Later that day, a local blog ran an article showing photos from the so-called inspection. The images were damning, selectively framed, clearly manipulated, designed to provoke concern and feed the narrative already swirling around him. One of the photos showed Jake's face, taken from a distance, framed in shadow like he was some lurking villain. And Jake had a good idea who was behind it. Meanwhile, inside the mirrored walls of Carson Auto Group's towering headquarters, Natalie stood before a boardroom full of suits, men and women who once clapped for her presentations, now eyeing her like a liability. At the head of the room, Brent Kessler clicked through his slideshow, his voice oozing false concern. "These," he said, tapping the screen, "are images from Mr. Jake Warren's garage, yes, that Jake Warren. The same man our CEO has been associating with. This is a PR nightmare in the making. I don't need to remind you that public trust is fragile, and investor confidence even more so." Natalie didn't flinch, her fists clenched under the polished mahogany table. "We've had negative media mentions, shareholder concerns, and rising pressure from competing partners," Brent continued. "It's not personal, it's just business." A board member cleared his throat. "Natalie, you've always been our sharpest strategist, but this situation, it's causing damage. We have to think long-term." Brent leaned forward, smug. "There's a solution. Step down, gracefully. Let someone else lead with a clear head. Walk away from the distraction." Natalie looked around the room, faces she knew, faces that had once championed her vision, now shrinking from the fire. And behind those corporate eyes she saw Jake, saw the garage, the rusted tools, the fire in his voice when he talked about legacy and loss. She took a long breath. "If what you're asking," she said slowly, "is for me to turn my back on someone who's being falsely accused, someone I believe in, then I won't." Brant narrowed his eyes. "Then we'll proceed with a vote of no confidence." Natalie straightened her back. Her voice came clear and calm. "You won't need to. If you no longer want a CEO who stands up for what's right, even when it's hard, then I resign." The room fell into stunned silence. She walked out without looking back. 3 days later, Jake was at the garage, surrounded by the mess left behind by the so-called inspection team. He stood among shattered glass, overturned toolboxes, and stacks of flyers someone had slipped under the door, painting him as careless, unsafe. It was all a lie, but lies shouted louder than truth sometimes. He was exhausted, angry, alone. For the first time in years, he thought about walking away, selling the land, packing up the tools and leaving behind the dream that had once belonged to his father. Then he heard her voice. "Hey, stranger." He turned. There she was, Natalie. No designer suit, no title. Just jeans, scuffed boots, and work gloves already stained with grease. In one hand she held a broom, in the other, a box of supplies. He stared at her, stunned. "I heard you could use a hand," she said. Jake didn't move. Couldn't. She stepped forward, her eyes soft but unwavering. "I know I hurt you, and I know I've got no right to ask anything of you, but I couldn't stay silent while they tore you apart, so I left it all behind." His voice was low. "You gave up everything." "Not everything," Natalie replied. "I still have my hands, my heart, and I'm here." She knelt, picked up a wrench from the ground, and began cleaning. Jake watched her in silence, something breaking loose inside his chest. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel like he had to fight alone, and maybe, just maybe, that was worth everything. The bell above the door jingled as Jake stepped into the small-town clinic, the same one where his mother had been quietly receiving treatment for the past year. He carried a bouquet of wildflowers in one hand, something to brighten her room after the chaos of the last few weeks. As he walked down the hallway, he passed two elderly women chatting near the reception area. "She was here again yesterday," one of them whispered. "The blonde one. Brought more books for the waiting room. And I think she paid for that new lift chair in Ward B. Such a kind soul," the other said. "You know, I heard she covered all of Mrs. Warren's hospital bills, too." Quiet as a shadow, Jake stopped in his tracks. He turned slowly. "Excuse me? Did you say someone paid for my mother's care?" They looked at him, surprised. One of them nodded. "Yes, a woman, blonde hair, comes in quietly, never wants attention." His heart skipped. "Do you know her name?" They shook their heads, but the receptionist nearby leaned over and said softly, "You can ask to view the donation ledger. It's public for transparency." Minutes later, Jake stood in front of the front desk as the woman pulled out a binder and flipped to the recent donor section. She turned the page and pointed. Donor, name, Natalie Hudson. Amount, full care sponsorship. Patient, Margaret Warren. Jake stared at the page, everything inside him tightening. She had never told him, never used it to win favor. She had done it when they weren't even speaking. He stepped outside, breath catching in his throat as he whispered to himself, "I was wrong. I let my old wounds blind me to a good heart." Rain was beginning to fall as Jake drove, tires slicing through puddles on the country road leading toward the town's old train station. The sky was heavy, slate gray. He reached the station just as the 4:20 p.m. departure was being announced over the tinny loudspeaker. Through the crowd, he saw her, Natalie, standing alone on the platform, suitcase by her side. She was staring down the tracks, arms crossed against the wind. He ran. "Natalie!" She turned. For a second, they just stared at each other, everything unsaid swirling in the air between them. Jake walked up, soaked to the bone, breathing hard. "You were going to leave without saying goodbye?" "I figured you'd already said it," she replied quietly. He shook his head. "I was wrong. About you. About everything." She blinked, unsure whether to believe him. "I found out what you did, for my mom, for the clinic. You didn't tell me, you didn't have to. I didn't do it to be forgiven," she said. "I did it because I love you." The words landed like thunder in his chest. Jake stepped closer. "I don't know what comes next, but I know this. When I thought I lost you, it felt like losing my father all over again. And I'm not going through that again." The train whistle blew in the distance. Natalie looked at him, tears starting to fall. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying," Jake said, reaching for her hand, "don't get on that train." She didn't. The rain had slowed to a gentle mist, softening the world around them as the last car of the train disappeared into the distance. The platform, once buzzing with announcements and shuffling footsteps, now fell into a sacred silence, broken only by the soft hiss of the departing engine and the heartbeat thunder in Jake's chest. A single lamp above them cast a warm, golden glow, shimmering against the lingering droplets in Natalie's hair, catching the glint in her eyes filled with something he hadn't dared to believe in until now: hope. Jake stood, breathless, soaked to the skin but unaware of the cold. All he saw was her, all he felt was the moment. He stepped forward, voice low and uneven. "Natalie," he began, "I know I've never been good with words, or trust, or letting people get close. I've spent most of my life keeping people at a distance because it felt safer that way." She opened her mouth to speak, to stop him, but he gently raised a hand. "No, please, let me say this." He took her hand and placed it over his chest, right where his heart hammered beneath the layers of his soaked shirt. "I've spent years fixing things, broken parts, cracked engines, rusted-out frames. It made me feel like I was in control, like I could always make something right, even when the world around me wasn't. But you weren't something I could fix, Natalie. You were the one who fixed me." Her eyes brimmed, and her lips trembled as she struggled to hold back emotion. Jake took another step closer. "That night you walked into my garage, I thought I was just helping a stranger. Turns out I was saving myself without even knowing it. You reminded me of who I was, who I could be." Tears slid freely down her cheeks and she reached up to touch his face. Jake reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small, weathered velvet pouch. Carefully, he opened it and revealed a ring, not shimmering with gemstones or gold, but made of polished steel and silver, shaped from the first lug nut he'd ever tightened as a child beside his father. "I've kept this for years," he said softly. "It was the first thing I ever fixed, a piece of the past I never wanted to lose. And now, I want it to be a part of something new." He knelt down, not with grandeur, but with reverence, with truth. "I don't have much, Natalie. No mansions, no empires, just a good pair of hands and a heart that's never been fuller than when it's near you." He looked up, rain clinging to his lashes. "This ring, it's not gold, it's not expensive, but it's mine. And I'm giving it to you, because I'm yours. Natalie Hudson, will you marry me?" A breath hitched in her throat. She stared at him, not with disbelief, but with overwhelming clarity. Then, suddenly, she dropped to her knees in front of him, laughing through tears, her arms wrapping around his neck. She cupped his face in her hands, voice shaking. "It's not gold," she whispered, "but it's perfect. You're perfect." Jake smiled, tears of his own threatening to fall. "And that's the only kind of love I've ever wanted," she said, pressing her forehead to his. "The kind that's real, the kind that chooses you, even when it's hard." He slid the ring onto her finger, cool metal meeting warm skin, like two pieces of something long broken finally fitting back together. She kissed him, slowly, fully, there under the mist and the station light, in a moment that didn't care about the past or the future. There were no headlines here, no boardrooms, no betrayals, just Jake and Natalie, just steel and soul. Just love, raw, unfiltered, and finally free. And this time, Jake didn't just fix something, he rebuilt it. He rebuilt them, and so, in a world where engines break and hearts often break faster, a mechanic and a billionaire heiress found something neither of them expected: love, forged not in luxury, but in truth. He gave her honesty, she gave him hope, and together they rebuilt not just a life, but a future. Because sometimes, the most beautiful love stories don't come wrapped in diamonds or gold, but in grease-stained hands, selfless hearts, and the courage to forgive. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories, where we bring you powerful, heartfelt tales that remind us all that kindness still matters, love still heals, and every soul has a story worth telling. Until next time, stay open, stay tender, and never stop believing in second chances.